Okay, man, are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go. Now, come on, now crank this motherfucker up.
Break it down like this.
Hello, Internet. Gino, that big Reno Greco here again with another episode of Deep Listens, and today we're going to be talking about Vagrant Story, the story of Ashley Riot, possibly one of the best named characters of all time, and his journey through the cursed, haunted city of Leamond. And joining me to discuss this game is Pete Busby, as always. Hey, Pete.
Hey, what's going on? Ashley Riot, good name, but nothing will ever compete with Manly Tinderstaff, the best name ever devised ever. In honor of May the 4th, which is the day we're recording this, I have a sweet Star Trek fact for everyone.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's going to be good, trust me. Did you know that the first interracial kiss on television happened on Star Trek?
Yeah, it was Uhura and someone else.
Yep, and Captain Kirk.
Right?
The way they got away with it, so to speak, is Captain Kirk was being mind controlled. So they could be like, it's an interracial kiss, but he didn't really mean it.
Mm-hmm.
So they got away with it it was either the 50s or the 60s. Probably the 60s. So progress, but not really. But, sci-fi has been pushing, in some ways, culture forward and holding it back in a lot of others. So, it fits.
Yep. For every interracial kiss, there is a show like Firefly where it's all white characters speaking Mandarin.
Oof. Yeah, that's a thing.
That other voice you hear is M. Palladino. Hello, M.
Hello. I'm sure someone is going to get on our case about you using Star Trek in a May the 4th.
No.
I don't know.
What?
I'm just gonna hang that lampshade right now.
It's the 4th of May from Star Trek. May the Force be with you from Star Trek.
Gandalf said that.
Yeah, when Gandalf said it in Star Trek. Everyone remembers.
To Harry Potter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep,
I've seen that meme.
They were on a planet, and they were like, may the Force be with you, and then beam me up, SpongeBob.
Exactly. Anyway, Pete, you weren't on the Discord, so you don't know that I have very strong feelings about this game, but we're going to hear them.
There are strong feelings to be had about this game?
Very much so.
Oh, yeah. It's a contentious one.
And might be petitioning for this to be Game of the Year when the year ends. We'll see.
I think this game is genius. We'll talk about it.
All right, so before we get into Vagrant Story, our normal housekeeping, you can get in touch with the show at DeepListensPod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We have our comment sections and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. You can also support the show on patreon.com/deeplistens. And if you were to do so, you might end up on the Discord report.
The Discord report. Boop-a-doop-a-doop-a-doop-a-doop. This week on the Discord, something happened with Giant Bomb, which people are freaking out about. I don't follow Giant Bomb. Can you tell me what happened?
Yeah, so GiantBomb.com, the website that, most of the folks who listen to the show probably learned about me and the show from Giant Bomb's forums or from my freelancing there at some point. So Giant Bomb was founded now almost 13 years ago, and the core, 4 people have been there the whole time. Jeff, Vinny, Brad, and wait, no, 3. I guess those were the 3 who have been there basically the whole time. And today, Vinny Caravella, Brad Shoemaker, and Alex Navarro, who have all been with Giant Bomb and GameSpot for almost 2 decades at this point, those 3 gave their notice.
Oh, wow.
So, Vinny, who has been there since day one, Brad also there since day one, and Alex, who joined pretty soon thereafter, all of them gave their notice. Though I guess technically it was just Ryan and Jeff to start, and then some of the other GameSpot folks absconded a little bit shortly after once they had a site that functioned. So it's an end of an era. It's a big bummer. I'll say personally, as someone who listened to the Giant Bomb cast for almost 10 straight years, every single week, and watched almost every single video they posted for years and years and years, it's sad to see a change like this. I understand why. They've all been at it for decades at this point, and, you can get burned out doing something for so long, but it's a big change. It's a bummer. I wish all three of those folks good luck on their next endeavors, and they looks like the site will still be, going on. It's not like it's shutting down. They'll be changing up how they do things, but, Giant Bomb changes, it doesn't end. That is why people were in the Discord. Another thing that came up in the Discord, Pete, we want to say congratulations for being drafted first in the NFL draft.
Hey, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm really looking forward to it. It's an exciting opportunity. The only downside is I have to go to Jacksonville.
Hate to see it.
Is this a basketball joke that I don't understand?
No,
football joke you don't understand.
If you look at the first overall draft pick in the NFL draft, it just basically the guy looks exactly like Pete.
Congratulations.
Yeah, so the Discord gave you a shout out and congrats on your new endeavor.
Nice.
All right, so I think that mostly covers it. We do, I guess, another thing worth mentioning from the Discord, we're streaming more now.
I put a notification channel in there, which is linked up to a lot of our regulars, ZP, Arbitrary Water, me, Gino, and we've got a pretty good flow going. I was streaming a lot of Vagrant Story this week. We were doing some Final Fantasy TCG a while ago.
Yep, I've started playing through Final Fantasy IX using the Moggery mod, which
it looks so good.
It's a mod that used deep learning technology to up-res all of the screens of Final Fantasy IX, which has made that game look better than it ever looked, which is wild for a game that's almost 20 years old now. Or I guess it's over 20 years old. It's like 22 years old.
They should have done that to Final Fantasy VIII before they put it on the Switch.
Well, I mean, the folks that made that mod are just modders. It was not Square. It's not official in any way. So they should hire those people to then perform that same witchcraft on 9 and 8.
It looks better than what they did. So
it sure does.
That's saying something.
Yeah, so FF9, better than it's ever been. So I'm playing through that and not speedrunning it, just playing through it for funsies. So you can check out my stream, That Pinguino, on Twitch, and your stream.
GameMaker M, also my Twitter. I post it everywhere. Trying to get affiliate so I can get emotes of my cat.
I've got affiliate. I've got emotes of myself. Or of my little penguin.
That's cute.
All right. So with that, my obsession was going to be Giant Bomb, so you already filled that in. So we can instead move on to Vagrant Story. Since you've gotten into Vagrant Story the most of all of us, why don't you explain what a Vagrant Story is?
So the year 2000, Square Enix developed and published this game. The producers who worked on Final Fantasy Tactics decided they wanted to do something a little bit weirder than their usual fare. So this is a dungeon crawler set in Ivalice, which you will recognize if you are a fan of the Final Fantasy series. There are no Final Fantasy characters, as far as I'm aware. I'm about 50% of the way through. But it is all going through dungeons, fighting enemies. Occasionally there's some story in the form of flashbacks. You are fighting as Ashley Riot, trying to find this guy, Sydney, who is a weird guy with no shirt and claw hands.
Yeah, are they? I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is a pressing question. They're machine hands, right?
Yeah, they're like armor. I don't know what the relevance is of those. Also, Ashley has assless chaps. This is an important factor that we need to address right off the bat.
Everyone in this game is so thick.
Yeah.
From like Ashley, is it Rosencrantz or Gilbert? Both of them probably.
Yeah. Both of them.
Both.
Everybody's stupid thick.
There's a lot of Shakespeare characters. You'll see them all over the place. Direct references.
Yeah. So they were definitely going for a kind of Shakespearean it's not high fantasy. It's more of a, how would I even describe it? There's a lot of dukes and duchesses and palace intrigue, but then all of the actors in the story are kind of low-level soldiers and knights for the most part, with the occasional cardinal or, knight commander sticking in there. but it's largely a group of people. There's the Crimson Knights, the cult Mollenkamp, with their leader, Sidney Lostero, and Ashley Riot is a risk breaker who's been sent in to capture Sidney. So he's just kind of a single elite unit. He's like an army in a can.
Part of the CPK, right?
Editor's note, the CPK is actually the VKP.
Yes, and the CPK...
I forget.
It's basically like Parliament. Think of it like a government organization. So he's almost like an elite UN soldier, kind of.
He's the Green Beret of whatever this world is.
Yes, and while this game is set in Ivalice, it does not have any major callbacks to Final Fantasy Tactics. It has had callbacks in like Final Fantasy XII, but it's not directly referencing any locations. It's more of Ivalice is more of a state of mind than anything else. It's more about high drama and generally middle England, I guess, would be it's a very European setting overall.
Yeah.
So when the game starts, man, the first thing I want to talk about is downloading this game, because downloading this game blew my damn mind. How big is this game?
This game is 97 megabytes, which is impossibly small.
Oh, never mind.
It's less than like a tenth of a gig, which for a PlayStation 1 game is insane. Like, the opening movie is probably 10% of that, is what Gino said in the Discord.
I mean, the pre-rendered opening video is probably, that plays on like the start menu. That's probably a significant portion of it. Like, music and that is probably a significant portion of that overall file size. Just, Pete, for reference, like, Final Fantasy 8 and 9 are, I think, both 2 or 3 gigs.
Oh, shit. That's like 200, 300 times bigger?
Yeah. Like, this game is smaller than most indie titles we've played on this show.
Wow. I know nothing about file sizes, apparently. That's crazy.
It's absurd. Like, the amount of fidelity and graphical quality that they packed into this thing is absurd. Other things that jump out, you might have noticed this game's lighting, that there are shadows and characters who are shaded appropriately. They didn't have a lighting engine.
That's all done by hand.
Yes. So they basically had to mock up, okay, here's where the light source is in this room. How would it fall on this person's face?
You're telling me the sensuous shadows on Sidney Riot's buttocks were done by hand?
Yep.
Ashley Riot.
Incredible.
And, like, they also seem to have created some sort of lighting system inside the dungeons themselves where you get brighter or darker depending on where you stand in the rooms, which is also, like, for this era, it's absurd. Like, I've never seen anything like it. In first person, there's a first person mode too. Did you notice that there's a damn ceiling to all the rooms?
You can look at any angle. I think there was a quote somewhere where one of the directors was like, they wanted every angle to look like a painting. And so you can look up and you will see the ceiling. And sometimes there are skylights up there and rafters and things. It's insane.
The reason why we're calling this out is because the game is presented largely in an isometric format where the camera basically cuts through the ceiling and cuts through most walls so that you can focus on the action. So it's really only in first-person mode that any of this is relevant. Many of the scenes and dungeon areas in this game look gorgeous in first person on a fucking PlayStation 1 and then are functional with the camera in third person. So, like, the amount of craft put into this game is just staggering. This might be the most technically impressive game we've ever played, especially for the era. So, just want to call that out. If you see nothing else, like, the opening cutscene of this game is ridiculous. It's all in engine, which was not the norm at the time.
All of the cutscenes are in engine, which is why the file size is so small. Incredible.
And, I mean, the captions and everything have a very comic book style. The localization, headed by Alexander O. Smith, is widely regarded as one of the best translations ever.
I'd be curious, too, are the names the same?
Yes.
In the Japanese version, so it's still Rosencrantz and Gilderstein?
Yeah, it's Romeo Guildenstern and...
Guildenstern,
I think Jan Rosencrantz? Yeah, Jan Rosencrantz.
Yeah, I have no idea what Shakespeare's purchase is like in other countries. That's the only reason I ask.
Yeah, so this was kind of this era of Square. They were really in their Shakespearean bullshit. Final Fantasy IX came out about a year prior to this, and it also has a lot of Shakespeare references in it.
Okay.
So there was a company-wide infatuation at this time. So when we get it, it's like the game starts with Sydney raiding a mansion of the Duke Aldous Byron Bardorba. That guy. And kidnapping his son, Joshua, and then absconding to the city Leamond. Ashley, tries to stop Sydney, shoots him in the heart with a bow, and then Sydney just pulls it out of his heart and gets up and walks away. So we know pretty early on, magic is afoot, things are not what they seem, and Leamond as a location is, I think, one of the most unique locales that we've seen in a game for a while. Like, it's very old European city, and similar to games that have come since, it's an old city with a secret, with a nasty secret.
Yeah, the whole thing was very, like, multiple parts of the game, we'll get into this a little bit more, felt very Full Metal Alchemist.
Yes.
To me. I mean, from Sydney's arms to the city's disturbing secret. I checked, though, Full Metal Alchemist came out after, so if anyone's biting on anybody, it's Full Metal Alchemist.
But Full Metal Alchemist also published by Square.
Really? I should have known that.
Huh.
I should have done better research.
Is it really?
I believe so. I believe it was published by Square Soft. Let me look it up. So, Em, what did you think of Leamond, like the initial introduction to this city?
I mean, for a while you are underground. There is a lot of just going through these cave systems. When you finally get to the surface, it's very like European, kind of like Italian villa situation. A lot of like waterways and tightly knit buildings that make corridors where you're going to be fighting enemies. It's very the introduction to, I believe, Dark Souls 1.
Yeah, or Demon Souls, both of them.
Yeah, where you're fighting through that sort of, it's kind of a town, it's infested with zombies and things like that. There's going to be a lot of discussion of Dark Souls, I feel like, in this conversation. It feels very much like the direct precursor to Demon Souls, Dark Souls. A lot of the scenery and such feels very in that same genre. The enemies that you're going to fight, and a lot of the mechanics are pretty similar as well. So that was immediately what I went to, was this kind of like, gotta check every corner for enemies that are lurking behind it, but it's all isometric, so you're probably going to see them situation.
Yeah, and there's lots of traps that if you step on a square, it fucks you up.
Yeah.
Like, this game felt to me like a mix between The Witcher 2 and Dark Souls in some ways, because the Souls games, there's a little bit of prep between battles, but a lot of the time, if you know what you're doing, you can kind of run through it without necessarily using the most preparation. You can kind of out-action game a lot of bosses. But The Witcher is a lot more about figuring out what you're going to fight, making sure that you apply the right ointments and spells so that you can actually deal with what you're dealing with. So if you're fighting a goblin, maybe you have to drink a potion that makes you stronger against goblins. You need to take out your silver sword because it's good against monsters. Then you might need to cast like 3 spells, and then you fight the goblin. And this game is very similar. Like, in any given fight, you might need to switch out a blade and a hilt to make a sword that's imbued with the right elemental statuses to take on a boss, and then you'll have to buff yourself, debuff the boss. You might then need to actually execute. And this game has a very interesting combat system for the time. It's kind of a timing-based system where you perform attacks by pressing I believe it's the circle button on a PlayStation controller, which will cause a sphere to come out of Ashley, and he can attack anything that falls inside of that sphere. And not just any enemy, but enemies are broken down by body parts, so you can target specific body parts as well. So like, you can go after an enemy's right arm, or its legs, or its head, and each of those different body parts might have different vulnerabilities, different HP levels, and if you do critical damage to a body part, the enemy will take much more damage. And also if you deal critical damage to the legs, the enemy will lose 50% movement speed.
You know what it reminded me of in that capacity is just Fallout 3. Basically,
Yeah.
It's that same sort of pause, pick a spot, you get a percentage on that spot sort of combat.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
it's like the VATS system in
Yes.
Fallout.
And on top of that, once you pick an attack, you can then chain your attacks using the risk system. And want to explain chaining and risk?
So basically, this is one of the things that I think the game does a little bit of a bad job explaining to the player. There's a few things that need to be better represented. But the chain system, whenever a attack is made, there will be an exclamation point that pops over Ashley's head. And then if you time it where you swing again using anything besides X, you can assign attacks to. So if you press circle is what I usually have, like a do more damage button. If you time it correctly, you will continue to attack the enemy. And you can use things such as there are ways to get back health. You can restore your MP based on a percentage of the attack that you've done already. And so you can combo off, and each time you do, your risk will get a little bit higher. So certain abilities are more risk intensive, and depending on where they are placed in the chain, they will increase your risk by a percentage. So in order to chain, you also need to use different abilities. So you need to kind of have a rotation between your different chain abilities. And you usually want to go no further than like 8, because after that it gets exponentially more risk intensive. And when your risk goes up, the likelihood of hitting enemies goes down, and the amount of damage that they will do to you will go up. So you kind of want to mitigate that with not going super hard with your combos, and there are certain items that can reduce your risk if it gets to pretty intense levels, and it caps out at 100. And then you're basically never going to hit anything unless you have boosting abilities and such in play. That's a risk. It's a little bit not what you're used to if you're playing these sorts of games. The other way to reduce it is to put your weapon away. And as long as your weapon is sheathed, you will not increase your risk. It'll actually start going down, even if you're in combat.
Yeah, sheathing your weapon will let your MP and your HP and your risk kind of all recover much faster than when your weapon is out.
Yeah.
So Pete, what did you think of this system? Like, it's a very big departure from most of the systems we've played with, but I think it's one of the more interesting ones to play.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time you're rewarded for combos. And I mean, granted, like you get the extra sort of bonus hits in, but you do take that added risk. I think it too, correct me if I'm wrong, Em, I very easily could be, but I think your crit rate increases with risk.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so there is one sort of bonus to it. Like Em said, though, I mean, it's pretty poorly explained, so if I'm being perfectly honest, I ignored it most of the time. My strategy was basically to keep my risk as low as possible and sort of hit them with the big shots, so to speak.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. I started to get a little bit more into my combos because in order to gain the new weapon arts, or I think it's the break arts actually, you need to do a certain number of combos. And so in order to get more experience, basically, there's no experience system in this game, but whatever you call it, you need to do a combo past 1, and then at each one after that, it adds however many combos you do to that score, and then when you cap it out, you get another, like, chain ability. That was why I was like, oh, I better start actually using those some more. And then once you get the timing down with each type of weapon, it gets a little bit easier to plan for. This is all dependent on, like, weapon agility. How fast you are determines how long the animation is and when the exclamation point will appear over Ashley's head. So I generally kept my weapon speed pretty fast. I know that some of the larger weapons have really long speeds, and I was not about to plan accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this game has a lot of systems going on. Like, there's the risk system, which you unlock further chain attacks, and there are defensive chains as well that will sometimes reflect damage back at your enemy. Some of them will prevent you from getting hit with negative status effects. Some of them heal your HP. So those sorts of effects are used, moment to moment. There's also break arts, which are kind of super moves that consume HP to do a slightly more powerful attack. And then there's magic, which you get kind of after every boss fight, or most boss fights. You're given a grimoire, which is a book that you can use in combat. And once you use it on an enemy, you'll learn whatever spell was in it, or use it on yourself. So if it's a, healing spell, you cast it on yourself, and then you master the spell. If it's an offensive spell, you use it on an enemy. So you're juggling this MP, which restores very quickly outside of combat. Same thing with HP as well. Break arts are used mostly to kind of change the damage type that you're doing with a given weapon, and I think that's a good way to move into the damage type system. In this game, the types of weapons you use are important both because of their overall stats and their animation speeds and their kind of standing reach. Spears go further than daggers, which are very small, and then bows go even further than spears. There's also type of damage. Can you explain the damage type system?
Yeah, so this is another one of those systems that the game sort of tries to tell you about, and then I don't know if they're successful or not. Let's see, where should we start?
Game FAQs is successful at it.
Game FAQs does a really good job of explaining this. Not sure the game itself does. If there was a manual, I feel like a lot of this would be explained there. There is an in-game manual that is supposedly a quick manual, but there's a lot of words for a quick manual. Anyway, the damage type system. Whenever you use a weapon, you are using it against a type of enemy, which is divided into 6 different categories. Human, which is like humanoids, beast, dragon. I don't have it in front of me.
God, there's so many
evil,
dragons in this game.
Phantoms.
Yeah, there are 6 types. Phantom, undead, evil, dragon, beast, human. Yeah, it's in a different order than that, and the order actually does matter. But that's basically the set. Whenever you use an item against a enemy of that type, you have a chance of raising your affinity with that weapon against that type of enemy. So there is a setting further down in the settings where you can turn on, like, when your affinities change. If you're going to play this game, I highly recommend you turn that on, because Gino did not realize that that was even a thing. And it's super useful, but it starts with that off by default. And I don't know if you'll have as much of a sense of what your weapons are at if you don't have that on.
Super didn't. I don't know why it's off by default, but it is.
That is an excellent question. I don't remember why I turned it on, but I saw it was off. I was like, I probably need to know this. So I turned it on almost immediately when I went into the settings. And that also extends to your armor. Whenever you're hit by a certain type of enemy, your affinity with that enemy type will go up. You're well versed at dealing with those types of enemies with that set of armor. This is also carried over into the elemental system. It's a standard Final Fantasy game, so we got fire, water, earth, air, light, dark, and each of those are paired off with each other. If you are fighting a fire enemy, you want your element to be opposite of what that is. So you want a high water affinity if you're fighting a fire enemy, which is the easiest way to explain it. Only the highest number is going to determine your affinity. All weapons start with physical affinity, and then as you use them against certain enemy types, you increase your affinity with each type. And you can also change this with gems. So if you need a quick boost, like I was fighting earth enemies and I needed a bunch of air affinity, I threw a bunch of gems onto my weapons, and then it made it really well versed at dealing air damage. And so you can kind of change those on the fly. There's no cost to switching your gems out. That is like one of the most useful things in your arsenal when dealing with enemies. And that's basically the affinity system. Did I explain everything?
Yeah, so there's the elemental affinities, there's the enemy type affinities, and then there's also the damage types. So there's blunt, piercing, and slashing, basically. The three types, and each of the different enemies will have a weakness to one of these types. And it can vary from body part to body part, just in case it was not difficult enough to juggle everything.
Yes.
My God.
This is another important thing that they don't explain. When you use the analyze skill, it's like a spell you get after a couple of bosses. You will analyze the enemy, and then in order to actually see the information you analyzed, you need to go into your menu, go to the status menu, and then hit the left trigger.
Navigate to the enemy. Basically.
Yeah, to navigate to the enemy. And there it will have all of the explanations of body part, of weapon affinity. And this is explained nowhere in the game. I had to figure this out by trial and error, basically. So if you're going into it, just know that scanning it will not bring it up like in any other game.
You'd think they'd want to brag more about this stuff. They spent all the time cramming this many mechanics into a game, and they're just we'll figure it out.
There's a section in the menu that has tutorial text, and it's got a dang README file, which is also very funny.
It's so long. It's 20 things on that one README, and
it doesn't even cover everything.
It doesn't. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so we've gone over how you deal damage, how you chain, and what's PP and durability.
Yeah, durability goes down as you deal damage to things. Simple enough. This is determined based on the weapon when you craft it. And then as you craft more items, it can go up or down depending on what you've put together. PP is phantom points, which are basically accumulated as you go through Leomund. And they are factored into the damage equation. So if you have a really high PP, you will do more damage than a weapon that's entirely the same that does not have that. And every time you repair your weapons, you set your DP to max, so your durability goes back to full, and then your PP goes all the way down, which is an unfortunate sentence.
Yep.
Then you have to accumulate that more as you go through the levels. So every time you restore your items, you're going to be a little bit hamstrung going forward, but it'll accumulate at a pretty regular rate. And there are chain abilities that you can use to boost it pretty quickly. Instill is the one that deals with PP, and there's another one, I think it's Temper, that restores your DP. So if you want to sort of bounce between those, you can keep your weapons pretty strong, but it's not necessary. I didn't have any trouble keeping my weapons from breaking. I never noticed any of my weapons shatter in my hands or anything, but I'm sure it could happen if you're not careful or if you don't fix your weapons when you go into a workshop.
Yeah, so you basically need to, whenever you go into a workshop, you need to fix your weapons. You want weapons that have a distribution of damage types, so you want some stabbing, some slashing, some blunt weapons so that you can fight whatever's appropriate. You also want weapons that have the appropriate affinities so that some of them can take down dragons or beasts or humans. So you need to juggle all of these things, and the game has a crafting system of its weapons to get you through this. Em, how do you craft things?
Okay, I'm so excited to talk about the crafting because going into this game, we were dreading dealing with the crafting system.
Yes, because it's a nightmare.
It is a nightmare, but it's a nightmare that you can sort of unpack once you know what to look for. So basically, in order to craft weapons, you are making blades for the weapon, and you are attaching a grip to it. The grip determines certain stats and how many gems you can affix to that weapon. So if you have a blunt weapon, you're going to want a grip that has a high boost to the blunt score of the weapon. That's the most basic form of the crafting. There's also the combining, which is where the complications come in. When you combine weapons, you are combining different blades or armor or shields. Armor and shields work a little bit differently. We'll just focus on the weapons. In order to basically upgrade your weapons, you are going to take a weapon and combine it with the next lowest weapon of that type. So if you want to make swords, you'll start with the simplest swords. Let's say it's a spatha and a rapier. You combine those two and then it makes a short sword. And then in order to get the next highest tier, you need that short sword and a phalange, which I believe is a Star Trek race.
Yes.
And that makes a Shamshir. And then if you combine the Shamshir with a Ferengi, it makes a Falchion. And then a Falchion and a Shamshir is a Shodal. There's kind of like this, it kind of staggers a little bit as you keep going.
Which of those words were real and which did you just make up?
I have no idea. A lot of these are like foreign words.
Shamshir is real. I know
yeah.
that.
Falchion is a
sword, right?
Okay.
We could look at the great swords, which are like broadsword plus katana is an executioner. An executioner plus a katana is a claymore. A claymore plus an executioner is a Shiavona, which I don't know.
I recognize the first couple.
Yeah, Shiavona plus claymore is a bastard sword. 2 bastard swords combined together is a Nodachi, and 2 Nodachis makes a rune blade, which is the highest level of great sword. So there are basically tiers of the weapons, and what you want to do is get the highest tier that you can make, and then get the tier below that one, and then combine it, and that will keep you going forward. There are also ways to like jump between weapon types. Like if you wanted to take your Norse sword that's really good and make it into a regular broadsword, which is it is a great sword, then you would combine it with something like a club or a spear or a bow. So you don't have to deal with any of that if you don't want to. I think getting the regular like crafting, at least understanding the principles behind it, I think will really help you moving forward through the game. I reached a point where I felt like the starting equipment just wasn't cutting it anymore. And so I dove into game FAQs to try and figure out what the hell was going on. And basically, it's all base stats. Anything higher is going to have higher base strength, and it's usually going to reset all of your weapon, like, affinity. It's going to reduce it to its base level. If you combine certain items that have really high stats in certain areas, it will carry over, but it goes high in either direction. So if it's high, like, positive numbers, it could take that, but if it's high negative numbers, it might take that one too. So you kind of want like a middle ground thing going into it, so it's not like, -5 and everything.
So, Pete, how many of these systems did you even interact with?
Oh, God. Like the bare minimum you possibly could have. Like, I was just picking things based on names I recognized for the most part. I was like, ooh, katana. That sounds cool. Let's see if we can build one of those.
There you go.
That was about my level of interaction with most of these systems because, as you said, the game does a piss poor job of explaining most of this stuff.
Really?
Yes.
You don't say.
Game FAQs does it. And this is where I think one of the Dark Souls aesthetics comes out the strongest. Dark Souls and its ilk were notoriously difficult to parse. And if I've learned anything from the Dark Souls experience, it's that a poorly defined game is just an online community waiting to happen. And Vagrant Story takes that as well. So, like, everywhere where the game does a piss poor job of explaining itself, online FAQ writers and communities have kind of filled in the gap and made this game more intelligible and playable than it would have been if you just tried to go in cold. Because this game's reception, like, it was widely praised as a technical achievement and a storytelling achievement. Like, the localization was outstanding. But this game is very polarizing because if you do not get those tutorials or you do not delve deep into it, you bounce right off this game. Like, you can easily die in the first few bosses and feel like you're making no progress and not understand why. Some of the bosses you'll just deal no damage to them, or like 1 damage. I took down some bosses simply by reflecting the damage they were doing to me back at them.
Yeah, I dealt with a lot of bosses that way.
Because, like, your physical attacks just don't do shit unless you've kind of performed this ritual before you got into the fight, where you buff yourself, you debuff your enemy, you have the right weapon type, you have the right damage type, and all of these things come together to allow you to do basic damage. And this is not a game where you level up very much. At the end of every boss fight, you'll spin a reel that will give you a potential to increase one of your base stats, like your HP, your strength, your intelligence, your MP. And then you'll also get some items that also randomly increase your stats, though it will tell you what stat it will randomly increase. So if you get an HP increasing potion, it'll increase your HP. It can be anywhere from 1 to like 5 or 6. And it's random as to how much you get. So your stats don't actually change all that much. Most of what you change is the weapons that you get. You can upgrade them. Your spells will give you new tools, and your ability to use this risk system upgrade. So it's really a game where most of the time, Ashley's not getting much better, but you, the player, are getting better. As you do that, you make more and more progress. But that is not, it's not for everyone. I bounced off this game pretty hard once I got into Leomond proper because, sometimes there's just bosses around every corner and they'll just be boss rushes with no real warning. And unless you're using an FAQ or a guide to go through this game, you won't be prepared for most of those fights. There are cases where you don't even know what kind of enemy you're fighting. Like, it looks like a beast, but maybe it's humanoid. Maybe it looks like a human, but it's a beast. And if you equip the wrong weapon, you can just find yourself doing no damage at all.
Yeah. One of the things that I think it needs to be conveyed better, that as soon as you get certain abilities, it's usually because it's time for you to start using them.
Yes.
Like, certain things like Degenerate, which reduces strength, you get really early on, and it's super helpful in dealing with any of the early bosses, because that will reduce their strength and also make you more likely to hit them. There's even though it's calculating their strength, it's somehow factoring into their defense as well. I don't know how that works, and certain things like Prostasia, which increases your equipment ability, something to do with your equipment, it makes it better. That one is super relevant. Past a certain point, enemies start doing it to themselves, which is when I was like, oh, I could be doing that to myself. And at a certain point, they will also start to reduce your abilities, which, you can mitigate that just by using something of the same type on yourself. Like, if they lower your strength, you could raise your speed, and that'll cancel it out because only one status effect can be in that slot at a time. And this is just stuff that the game throws at you and doesn't have any explanation for. And then you go on game FAQs, and they're like, oh yeah, at this point you should be using Prostasia every time you enter a boss fight to generate their strength and then tarnish their equipment. And then you'll be fine. And I was like, oh, okay, why wasn't I doing that this whole time? Because no one ever told me.
You know what this makes me wonder, too, is where Game FAQs gets its information from. Presumably, like you said, maybe there's a original guide somewhere.
Yeah.
But, how do they unpack all the, minor number changes going on in the background here?
There was the equipment, how combinations were made. They actually went into the game files and they, unpacked that. And they have, at the end of it, charts that are here's how the equipment is represented in the actual code. And that's how we know, if you combine this thing with this other thing, you'll get this result. Because it's there's a file offset, and there's these things that you just, armor.syd, that you could take a look at. And each number corresponds with a certain type of weapon. I don't know if they're doing the same thing for, enemy scores and all that. But if you use Analyze, you can see all of the scores on each body part. So I think they just, analyze every single thing. They're okay, you should probably hit the head with a piercing weapon because its piercing is minus 35 or something like that.
Yeah, this is madness. It's just time. It's throwing time.
Exactly. I mean, you could do it on a case-by-case basis yourself. I'm not having any luck with blunt weapons against this enemy. I better figure out what is effective quick before it kills me. But, do you want to do that every single room you go into? Probably not.
Yeah, and there's totally, every single room you go into, you can cast a spell to make sure that you can see all the traps that are in the room, because if you step on them, they'll damage you. You can cast spells to unlock certain chests. There's a lot of things in this game that are poorly explained or expect you to kind of spend a lot of time. And this is kind of why I bounced off of the combat. The overall UI and menuing in this game is pretty clunky, and you are asked to go into the menus fairly frequently to pick out the right attacks and do the right things.
Here's the other thing that I didn't figure out until I was about 20 hours into this game. There is a quick menu.
Yes.
Which L2 opens up a, shortcuts to your spells and your items and all that. And I was doing that by hand by going through the main menu every single time. And one of the things that it doesn't even have a quick key for is swapping between your weapons.
Yes.
Which seems like a huge oversight, in a game where you are rapidly swapping your weapons fairly frequently.
Yes, like menuing in this game is an entire thing. It takes so long to do anything, and the animations are also very long. So all of that really came together to just frustrate me a whole lot. So we haven't really talked much about the story. Leomond is kind of this. It's a city with a past, and it's very much inspired by old European cities. I think the first introduction to it, where Ashley is talking with what is her name? Calo Merlose, who's an inquisitor, about how to get into this city. And I guess 25 years before the events of the game, a gigantic earthquake killed almost everyone in this city. It also cut the city off by land from most of the rest of the continent. There are also gigantic whirlpools surrounding it, so you can't get there by sea. The only way in is through a wine cellar that has an entrance kind of outside the outskirts of the city. So you go into this wine cellar, and then as you kind of move through, you go from a wine cellar to a catacomb to kind of an underground temple until you eventually are able to kind of emerge in the city. And it has a very old... I mean, it reminded me of my time in Italy in some spots, and I believe that the development team went on location to kind of research what old European cities look like, and you can see it in a lot of the different locations you encounter. And it's just got a real feel to it. Like, it's an ominous, sort of creepy feeling to all of the levels in this game, which is impressive considering how many of these areas are basically dungeon crawls. They managed to convey a sense of dread to some of this stuff, even though you're, doing box puzzles and fighting the same handful of enemies over and over and over again. Pete, what did you take away from the game's setting and its overall story?
So, first off, a wine cellar being the only way to enter your city is a terrible plan. But, so, we'll just go through the whole story. So, one of the things that makes the city so, let's say, unique is that it's basically a tempest of evil forces. So, like, there's a darkness in the city that gives people their powers or raises people from the dead. Now, this was sort of always the case, but what happened was an earthquake killed everybody in the city, well, most of the people in the city, which created a whole bunch of dead bodies for this darkness to infect and then bring to life. So I was sort of struck by that idea that, okay, there's this catastrophe that completely decimated the city, and then that becomes an opportunity for a whole bunch of sort of usurpers and, shady characters to move in and leverage this calamity. I mean, it seems like games are basically obsessed with end of the world scenarios, but it was an interesting idea to sort of think, okay, like, what happens once the profiteers move in, but we'll give it a high fantasy sort of twist.
Yeah. So, like, the city was thriving, and then the earthquake happens, and it turns out all of the buildings in the city have runes etched into them because a dark cult founded the city. And so this earthquake basically is a gigantic... And some of the characters say as much, that, like, this earthquake was man-made to feed souls to this darkness. They call it the Dark, that grants people their powers, gives magical abilities to everyone who shows up in this city and spends enough time there. So, like, as the game goes on, all of the characters who have arrived in Leomond start to develop magical abilities simply from being in town long enough. So, like, Ashley Riot starts being able to, becomes clairvoyant. He can see through the eyes of other people on top of the spells that he can cast in combat. Calo Merlose can see people's inner truths, basically. She can read people's minds slightly. Sydney's immortal and can summon monsters of all types. John Harden, who's a goon who works with Sydney, he can summon monsters and lock doors with magic. Romeo Guildenstern, can, like, teleport and do all sorts of wild shit. So, like, seeing all these characters develop these magical abilities over time, it's a very interesting conceit, that this place is so rife with magic that you can't help being changed by it. And that's kind of what propels the story, is Guildenstern and Jan Rosenkrantz, who's supposed to be a risk breaker, shows up, and each of these characters are trying to take control of the city. The initial story is that the Crimson Knights and the VKP are there to take down the Mullenkamp cult. They are there to stop whatever magical nonsense is happening in the city. But over time, it becomes clear that actually these forces are in the city to take control of it and to seize the power for themselves. So another thing that's kind of central to the story is Ashley's past. So Ashley's a cipher for most of the game, but all we know about him is a flashback that we see early on of him with his wife and child until one day, and he's kind of having a picnic under a tree, and then I guess highwaymen show up, kill his wife, kill his child, and that's what sets him on the path to becoming a risk breaker. But that becomes a little bit more complicated. Pete, what did you make of this past for Ashley?
It's more interesting when it becomes complicated, right? So the initial idea that sort of, he had this wife and kid, and their only narrative function is to die, so he can go on this basically journey of, what would we call it? Sort of unfocused vengeance. You know, he just wants to sort of take it out on the world and the darkness within it. That's fine. That's okay. But what becomes more interesting is when Sidney shows up and he's like, oh, no. Wait. You were the one who killed your wife and child, but the CPK brainwashed you into thinking thieves and vagabonds did it, so you would join this elite assassin unit and then basically just go around with Rosencrantz and murder people. That's a much more interesting story, right? Sort of this idea that, okay, your patriotism is based on a lie. It's sort of, it's an idea of, brainwashing is sort of the simplest way to put it, but there's like a little bit more nuance there. But the game takes something that could have been very interesting and then tries to basically undermine it again, when by the end, I forget who tells Ashley Riot, but they basically make the point that, like, no, Sidney was probably lying, but either way, your past is your past. Make of it what you will. Which is a very sort of dumb message for a man that might have killed an innocent woman and child.
Yeah, so it is a shame that they undermine it at the very end. Like, Ashley is dealing with this internal struggle. He doesn't know who to trust, because Sidney does fuck with people. Like, that's one of his powers.
He very, very likely could have lied.
But Ashley, at the end, is basically told, like you said, it's your past. It can be whatever you want it to be. Who's to say that the past that Sidney told you is any stronger than the past you remember? Which is a
horrible, horrible lesson, especially in like a modern context.
Yeah, I mean, who's to say that you killed your mother? You know, your past is your past. It's your call if you want to think that some highwaymen came and killed them. Who's to stop you? So yeah, that's kind of a shame. But I think the overall story of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern kind of fighting for this power, and I guess, Pete, we should go into, like, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are references. Romeo, Guildenstern, Romeo obviously from Romeo and Juliet, right. Guildenstern and Rosencrantz from Hamlet.
Yes.
You want to explain who these characters are?
Yeah, they're basically nobodies in Hamlet. Like, they just sort of, they're messenger boys that show up. They sort of don't do much, and then I think Hamlet sends them out on a mission that's basically sort of doomed from the very beginning. They're killed off screen, and then somebody shows up and is like, yeah, they're dead. Like, they're, as I recall, and it's been a while since I've read Hamlet, admittedly, they're a very minor piece of the story.
Yeah, so they are Hamlet's childhood friends who get enlisted by his uncle Claudius to basically keep tabs on Hamlet, to stop him from being quite so emo and brooding.
And they do a terrible job.
And they do a terrible job because Hamlet immediately sees through them. He sees through them immediately. They, like, try to keep tabs on him, and he's suspicious of them at all times. And then they basically try to convince Hamlet to come with them on a trip to, I think, England. But Claudius gives them a letter that says, hey, Hamlet's a traitor to the crown, fucking kill him. And Hamlet sees the letter and edits it to basically say, hey, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are fucking traitors, kill them. And so they get sent off on this trip thinking that they're going to, you know, just take a normal trip, and then they get arrested and killed off screen.
Yep, and then somebody just shows up later on and says, yeah, they're dead. And then Hamlet's like, cool, everybody else will be in about 3 scenes anyway.
Exactly. So they're like, I think the reference here is because both of these characters, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, are not who they appear. In Hamlet, they're agents of Claudius who present themselves as friends. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in this game, Guildenstern is a cardinal who presents himself as a man of faith who is trying to stop this evil cult. He's got a girlfriend who kind of rolls around with him, but really he is a despot who is trying to take control of all of the darkness and all of the power in Leomond so that he can create kind of a fascist dictatorship. He wants to get this power so that he can control the entire realm by himself. And Rosencrantz he presents himself as a risk breaker. It's unclear if he actually is, because everyone's lying all the time in this game.
And he gets his ass whooped, like a lot.
Yeah, Ashley kicks his ass. He gets his ass kicked, I think, by Sidney, too. But he's immune to magic to a certain extent, so that makes him fairly powerful in this story. And he's playing everyone. Like, he's playing Ashley against Guildenstern, Guildenstern against Sidney, Sidney against Guildenstern, and he eventually ends up getting got. So I think that that's what they were going for with the reference, that these are kind of treacherous characters who are not to be trusted.
Yeah, and just
but beyond that.
Giving Guildenstern his due as well. He pushes his girlfriend off the roof.
He stabs her and then pushes her off the roof.
That's a good point. It's a very sort of Thanos move where he's like, I love you, and I even forget what the logic is. He's like, I love you, but I need to sacrifice you to take control of the darkness.
Yeah, so taking control of the darkness requires a tattoo on his back.
Yeah, which, let's stick with that for a second. He cuts it off Sidney's back, presumably sews it onto his own skin.
Yes.
And then murders his girlfriend.
Yeah, Sidney says basically, the power of the darkness does not come without a price. You must sacrifice someone innocent to appease it, basically. And so he kills his girlfriend in order to seize control of the city. And we kind of find out that, like, they're looking for this thing called the Grand Grimoire, which is supposed to be this big book of magic. And it turns out that the city is the book. So, like, all of the etchings on all of the walls, those are the magical runes that if you have this thing called, I believe, the Blood Sin is the name of the...
That's the name of the tattoo.
The tattoo, the sweet tattoo. If you have the Blood Sin and you commit this sacrifice, you can seize the power of the city for yourself. So, ultimately, Sidney decides to entrust the magic of the dark and the city and its upkeep to Ashley Riot instead. So he's acting to try and provide Ashley with the support to make him kind of the magical fulcrum of Leomond, because Ashley's dedication to justice is so strong. Like, everyone who's in this city is out for themselves, trying to do something nefarious. So Sidney sees this person who basically is a cipher who only cares about justice, and he's like, this seems like the best possible custodian.
I mean, in the land of the blind, one-eyed man is king. But, like, so I want to unpack Sidney's motivation for a sec, because I was very confused by it.
Sure.
So he's Cardinal? He's the Cardinal's son?
The Duke's son.
The Duke's son. That makes a bit more sense.
Bardorba.
And the Duke wants the city destroyed.
Yes.
So he sends Sidney to do it, basically.
So Sidney is the keeper of the dark. He is imbued with his power right now. The Duke was charged with taking care of the city. He was kind of the inheritor of this power in the first place. He charged it to his son Sidney, and then Sidney is trying to pass it on to someone else because the Duke is going to die soon. He is ill. And if the Duke were to die and there was not some sort of heir to the city, its power would be unleashed, basically. Okay. It would not be taken care of properly. So the dark would escape. And
then he murders Sidney because Sidney's already consumed by the dark. It's like a mercy killing.
Yeah, so when Sidney passes the responsibility on to Ashley, Sidney's immortal.
Right.
So he's done. He's like, I need to pass on. So his dad kills him. And
he has no arms, which it's tough.
He sacrificed his arms for power.
He did.
Yeah, so, I mean, I love some of these references. I think that there's a complicated story here. Like, there's all these characters who are lied to, who act on those lies. Hardin not knowing whether Sidney is ever honest with him or if he's being manipulated all the time. There's another soldier who I believe is under Guildenstern, who his brother is killed by Sidney. And so he's come to the city for revenge, and he summons a monster to try and take revenge, and then the summoning kills him.
Yep.
And then he becomes a zombie.
Yeah, and then he fights Hammer Guy.
He fights his own, like, first and second in command because he's a zombie driven mad by the need to kill. There's, like, just a lot of stuff going on in this story. And I wish that I enjoyed playing this game more.
I feel like they were like, you know what's, like, really, like, cool and edgy and people respect? An unreliable narrator. What if we just made everyone unreliable?
Yeah, I mean, but I feel like it's par for the course for the Final Fantasy Tactics people. They really love their highfalutin royals who are not what they seem, and their common folk who, you know, maybe don't have the best motivations, but you need to, you know, root for them because the people they're up against are even worse. Yeah, but some of the lines in this game, like, our realm is sick. It superates with profiteers. Like, the writing is really well done. And this translation is kind of held up as one of the gold standards. It's really one of the most beautiful games I've ever seen. Like, if you can look at the final credits and some of the art of this game, like the concept art that they play over the finishing credits, Guildenstern's portrait is amazing. Like, some of this art is just incredible. I miss the old FF Tactics art style. It was so good. But yeah, this is... Em, do you have any closing thoughts on Vagrant Story? It sounds like you're going to keep playing it.
Yeah, like, I think I'm at, like, something above 56% map completion, and I know that you cannot get 100% unless you do New Game Plus, which I don't know if I would have ever done when I started this game, but I'm considering it strongly as my first, like, stream endeavor, completing the regular game and then going on into the New Game Plus and doing the boss rush that's in there. So, I don't know. I still have a ways to go with it. I played it for upwards of 24 hours in game time now, and I think I'm about a little more than 2/3 the way through this story. So, a lot of the twists and turns that are coming are going to be interesting to see. But yeah, like, this game kind of scratched a Dark Souls itch that I've had that I didn't know that I was missing. When I started to play Dark Souls back in the day, I wasn't expecting to like that sort of gameplay, and this kind of continues that series in some ways. So, I don't know why, but I've become enamored with it, and it's a technical marvel. Once you immerse yourself in the gameplay, I think it's got its hooks in. So, here I am. Vagrant Story, Game of the Year 2021.
Nice.
A tyrant always dies alone, Guildenstern. In my dreams, I see an evil tyrant which would choke the world. It's good. Like, the writing is not overwrought, which is the thing. Like, a lot of these games get very verbose, and they are very much picky about how much people say. It's a little cryptic, in fact, because of how terse a lot of the conversations are. I enjoy it. I think it's, on the whole, a very interesting narrative style, writing style. The word choices are really impactful. Yeah. Rosencrantz, I name you worm as you crawl through the dust.
Ugh.
That line was really good.
Yeah, it's, I recommend it. I don't know that you will want to play all of it, but I recommend at least watching the cutscenes and maybe try the combat, see if you enjoy it.
I do recommend, if you are going to play it, read a guide, because there are things you are not going to be told in the actual game, and also, if you get stuck, it's not worth banging your head against.
Agreed.
Sometimes there are just, like, block puzzles that are kind of bullshit. Sometimes the enemies are a little trickier than most. This is a game that came out in a time when Prima strategy guides were a thing, and I'm sure they sold a lot of them for this one, because the crafting alone requires multiple tabs in my computer right now just to know what I'm doing, and I enjoy it, which is the most fucked up part.
Oh man, Axeman, as he's fighting his zombified former commander, now the slowest dance begins, partner.
That was the best line in the whole game. I forgot about that one.
Yeah, it says, a fine tomb we two shall share.
That's metal as hell.
Yeah, so Vagrant Story. Check it out if you can. Watch the cutscenes. They're only about 2 hours to watch all of them if you don't want to play it. But a technical marvel. This game looks like a demake. It looks like a modern developer coming in and saying, I'm going to choose a PS1 aesthetic and then go with that. Except it's like probably 1/4 the size of what a demake would actually take up on your computer.
The file size alone is worth downloading it just because it's 100 megabytes. What are you using those 100 megabytes for?
Yeah, as soon as I installed this game on my Vita, I was like, I'm clearly going to have to delete Chrono Cross or something, or one of the games that I have installed on there. It surely must be a big file. And no, it's like 97 megs. I guess it was on 2 discs. I don't even know how.
Huh.
Maybe there was a demo disc. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a special game, a very special game. Difficult to play, but a very cool thing that Square has never kind of revisited. And it's only been kind of referenced lightly in other games. It's honestly a shame that this game doesn't have more shine, you know?
Yeah, I think if they were to remake this game, keeping a lot of the aesthetic choices, maybe making the faces not so flat, and just fine-tuning the more esoteric of the mechanics, I think this would be like a game you could go back to constantly.
Yeah.
Very highly regarded in scores, definitely worth checking out.
And it's also worth mentioning, this was one of the only games on the PlayStation that had characters' eyes and mouths move.
Huh, I didn't know that.
That was one of the things, like, characters did not really have faces in Metal Gear Solid, which was one of the games that the developers of this game kind of looked to as a technical marvel. And they were like, well, we're going to do that, but also the faces and the mouths will move. And, you know, they honestly did it. That's not easy to put those textures onto these polys and then change them and have them look like actual dialogue on a fucking PlayStation 1. Most characters, like, the only real camera tricks that they do are like when characters kiss, they always cut away, because that would just look terrible. But most of the other stuff, like, they just did the dang thing. If something was supposed to be in shadow, they shaded half of the body. If there was a candle in the screen, they lit up that side and darkened the other side. It's all of it by hand, and it's also worth mentioning this game runs incredibly smoothly, as much as it was clearly pushing PS1 hardware. I did not notice any slowdown.
I did notice a little bit of, like, in certain spots where the, like, spells are going off. I don't know if it's just my emulator was weird, or if I was running it at too high a frame rate or something, but I did get a little bit of a slowdown there, which made certain chain abilities a little tough to pull off. It's also worth noting I did not have any sound for most of this, and the score is actually also very critically acclaimed.
Yes.
The emulator that I downloaded, something is wrong with the sound, so I just sort of played the OST in a YouTube window while I was playing it to simulate the feeling. Also, if you need something to listen to, it's pretty good.
Yeah. So that's it for Vagrant Story. Check it out if you can. I kind of picked this because I thought that the PS3 store was going away, and all the PS1 classics were too, but thankfully Sony has moved back on that, so you can get this game now. There's no rush, but you should go out and get it if you can. Give it a shot. And with that, I believe, Pete, it is now your turn once again to pick after Loop Hero and Vagrant Story.
Yep. So I was going to pick a more recent, I think the latest game from this studio, but this year is the 5-year anniversary of this game, which is a little bit more well known, and presumably, I shouldn't say presumably, supposedly the sequel is coming out this year too. So we might get a chance to play both. So I'm going to pick Oxenfree for my game this time around.
Ooh. I was like, sequel's coming out this year. Psychonauts 2?
I actually own this one already.
Yeah, I figured it's a classic adventure game. I've heard the comp is Stranger Things. It's sort of like a teen horror kind of game.
Ooh, excellent.
Yep.
I love teens being horrified.
That's what I thought. And we got some mean teens already. We'll get some scared teens this time.
Oxenfree. All right. Well, next up, we are playing Oxenfree. Yes, similar to games you've played, Life is Strange and Life is Strange Before the Storm. Okay.
Yep.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Pete.
Yeah, this was actually very interesting and the thickest game we've ever played.
Yeah, the assless chaps were a choice.
Yep, that was a power move.
Yes. Thank you, Em.
Thank you. If you're interested in seeing gameplay of this, I will probably be playing it for the foreseeable future. I still have a New Game Plus to get through. So check it out on my Twitch at GameMakerM, the letter M.
And thank you, listeners. A reminder, you can get in touch with the show at DeepListensPod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We have our comment sections and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. You can also support the show on patreon.com/deeplistens. Till next time, peace!